You wake up with a headache that feels like someone rented out your skull for a construction project overnight. You stumble to the medicine cabinet, grab an ibuprofen, swallow it with a sip of water, and about 45 seconds later, you're already moving on with your day. Problem mostly solved. Now do that again. Except it's 31,000 years ago. No ibuprofen, no medicine cabinet, no doctor, no hospital. And definitely no Google convincing you that your headache is either dehydration or an extremely rare tropical parasite that has somehow found its way into your apartment. It's just you, a pounding head, and a small group of people sitting around a fire, all looking at you with the same highly professional expression that basically says, "Yeah, we've got nothing." And here's the part that should be impossible. They survived. For hundreds of thousands of years before antibiotics, before surgery, before anyone had the faintest idea that bacteria even existed, humans kept surviving, raising families, and eventually building civilizations. Somehow they kept solving problems they couldn't even see. So maybe ancient people weren't wandering around completely clueless. Maybe they were running the longest medical experiment in human history, one painful mistake at a time. If you're enjoying videos that make history a little stranger than your textbooks ever managed, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. Because the most surprising part of this story isn't that our ancestors survived without modern medicine. It's that some of the things they discovered thousands of years ago are probably sitting in your medicine cabinet right now. You just don't recognize them yet. Most people picture ancient humans as unfinished versions of us, as if they spent their days sitting around a campfire thinking, if only somebody would hurry up and invent antibiotics. That's giving them far too little credit. Ancient people weren't primitive thinkers. They were empiricists without lab coats. When every mistake can be fatal, observation stops being a hobby. It becomes survival. You notice which berries make stomach pain disappear, which roots calm a fever, which water is safe to drink, and which river downstream from a dead mammoth is an opportunity to make a very poor life choice. Medicine didn't begin with chemistry. It began with paying attention. Observation became memory. Memory became tradition. Tradition became medicine. We can still watch the first chapter of that story today. Wild chimpanzees have been observed deliberately swallowing rough leaves and chewing bitter plants when they're sick. Scientists call this zoopharmacognosy, a fancy word that simply means animals using natural substances to treat illness. Some of those plants help remove intestinal parasites. Others contain bioactive compounds that reduce infection. The remarkable part isn't that chimpanzees do this. It's that humans did something completely different with the same idea. A chimp finds a medicinal plant. The chimp survives. A human finds one. The entire tribe might survive. Because humans don't just learn, we remember. We teach. One useful observation becomes one shared story. That story passes from parents to children, from healers to apprentices, until the discovery outlives the person who made it. Maybe the greatest evolutionary advantage we ever developed wasn't intelligence. It was collective memory. The ability to keep one good idea alive long after its discoverer was gone. That sounds convincing enough. But then archaeologists uncovered people who, by every rule of prehistoric survival, should have died years earlier. They didn't. And that's where this story becomes much harder to explain.
For thousands of years, everything we've talked about was just an educated guess. Then, archaeology started digging.
In 1957, researchers excavating Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq uncovered the remains of a Neanderthal man who had lived around 60,000 years ago. At first, he seemed unremarkable. Then they examined the bones. His right arm had been amputated above the elbow. He was partially blind. Advanced arthritis had twisted his spine and joints. Hunting would have been nearly impossible. Even gathering food would have been difficult. By every rule of Ice Age survival, he should have died long before he did. Instead, he lived for years. Someone carried him. Someone shared food with him. Someone chose not to leave him behind. Maybe the earliest form of healthcare wasn't medicine. Maybe it was compassion. But caring for someone is one thing. Operating on them is another. Across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas, archaeologists have uncovered ancient skulls with carefully drilled openings made using stone tools. The procedure is called trepanation. The shocking part isn't the holes, it's the healing. Many skulls show new bone growing around the opening, proving the patient survived. Some survived more than one operation, which is impressive, especially if you've been postponing your wisdom teeth appointment since last year. And then came Borneo. In 2022, archaeologists announced the discovery of a 31,000-year-old skeleton deep inside Liang Tebo Cave. The lower left leg had been surgically amputated with astonishing precision. There was no sign of an animal attack, no crushing injury. The bone healed cleanly, showing the patient lived for years after the operation. Picture that moment: a fire, a sharpened stone blade, a decision no human had ever recorded. Someone looked at a dying companion and decided they were worth trying to save. The first person to amputate a friend's leg may also have been the first person who refused to abandon a friend. And that may be an even greater invention than surgery itself. But even surgery could only save a few people. The thing that saved almost everyone else was growing quietly in the forest.
The first pharmacy in human history didn't have white walls, fluorescent lights, or someone asking if you had any questions about side effects. It had trees. In many ways, the forest was the world's first pharmaceutical laboratory. Scientists studying fossilized dental plaque from El Cedrón Cave in Spain discovered that Neanderthals were chewing yarrow and groundsel around 50,000 years ago. Neither plant offers much nutrition. Both taste unmistakably bitter. Yet both contain compounds now known to reduce inflammation and relieve pain. People rarely chew bitter plants for entertainment. Usually, they're trying to solve a problem. That instinct kept showing up. Ancient Egyptians reached for willow bark to treat pain and fever. So did Greek physicians. So did doctors in ancient China. So did indigenous communities across North America. 4 civilizations, separated by continents, separated by thousands of years. No shared language, no international conferences, not even a messenger pigeon. Yet they reached the same conclusion. At some point, coincidence stops being coincidence. It starts looking suspiciously like science. The active compound in willow bark is salicin. Your body converts it into salicylic acid, the molecule that inspired aspirin. In 1897, Bayer chemists created a stable version. But aspirin is only the beginning. Morphine came from the opium poppy, long used in ancient Egypt. Quinine came from cinchona bark, first used by indigenous peoples in South America. Artemisinin, the breakthrough malaria drug, came from Artemisia annua, a plant described in Chinese medical texts nearly 2,000 years before scientists isolated its active ingredient. Taxol, one of the world's most important cancer drugs, came from the Pacific yew tree. Vincristine, used to treat childhood leukemia, came from the Madagascar periwinkle. Then there was Ötzi the Iceman, found frozen in the Alps in 1991. He carried pieces of birch polypore fungus while suffering from intestinal parasites. Modern analysis suggests the fungus has antimicrobial and antiparasitic properties. He wasn't packing lunch, he was packing medicine. Maybe pharmacology didn't begin in a laboratory. Maybe the laboratory simply moved indoors. But if ancient people could get so many things right, why did they sometimes believe ideas that sound completely absurd today? This is where ancient medicine starts sounding less like science and more like someone desperately making things up. Take honey. Ancient Egyptians packed infected wounds with it thousands of years ago. It sounds like folklore until you look closer. Honey is naturally acidic, loaded with sugar, and slowly releases small amounts of hydrogen peroxide. Together, those conditions make life extremely difficult for many bacteria. Today, medical-grade Manuka honey is still used to treat stubborn wounds. The Egyptians weren't wrong. They were just about 3,500 years early, without the paperwork. Then come the maggots. Stay with me. Aboriginal Australians, the Maya, and later military surgeons all noticed that certain fly larvae cleaned infected wounds. The larvae eat dead tissue while leaving healthy tissue behind. Modern hospitals still use carefully sterilized maggot therapy when antibiotics fail, which means one of the oldest medical treatments on Earth is also one of the hardest to put on a hospital brochure. Spider silk sounds equally ridiculous until you learn that it helps protect wounds and is now being studied as a biomaterial for future surgery. Then, moldy bread. Ancient Egyptians packed it onto infected wounds. Nearly 3,000 years later, Alexander Fleming identified penicillin. History can be strangely competitive. But here's the real twist. How did they keep getting the treatment right while getting the explanation completely wrong? Because they weren't following good theories. They were following good observations. Germ theory, the discovery that microorganisms cause infectious disease, didn't emerge until the work of Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in the late 19th century. Before that, Greeks blamed the four humors. Medieval physicians blamed imbalances. Others blamed spirits, curses, or bad air. The models were wrong. The observations often weren't. That's the difference. A bad explanation can survive for centuries. A treatment only survives if patients do, and that leads to one of history's greatest ironies. Before antiseptic surgery became standard, many 19th century European hospitals had terrifying infection rates because doctors moved from patient to patient without washing their hands, and surgical instruments were reused without sterilization. Meanwhile, a Stone Age surgeon often worked outdoors with freshly knapped flint tools that had never touched another patient. Prehistoric brain surgery, better sterile conditions than parts of Paris in 1850. The universe occasionally has a spectacularly dark sense of humor. And somehow, we've still ignored the most valuable person in the entire tribe. When you hear the word shaman, it's easy to picture a mysterious figure waving smoke through the air and talking to spirits. Archaeologists picture something much less mysterious. The only doctor for miles. In 2021, researchers publishing in PLOS One re-examined a remarkable 12,000-year-old Natufian burial from the eastern Mediterranean. One grave stood apart from every other burial. A woman, around 40 years old, had been buried with more than 50 tortoise shells, eagle wings, leopard bones, wild boar remains, and even a human foot. It wasn't wealth, it was status. Most researchers believe she was a shaman. Notice who received the most elaborate burial. Not the best hunter, not the strongest fighter. The person who knew how to keep everyone else alive. A great hunter feeds the tribe for a week. A great healer might keep it alive for another generation. The frightening part is that none of her knowledge existed on paper. No books, no scrolls, no apprentices' notebooks. Every treatment, every plant, every lesson lived inside one human brain. Lose the healer, and you lose the entire medical library. Imagine losing Google, except there isn't any Wi-Fi, or electricity, or Google. Modern neuroscience suggests these healers were helping people in ways they could never have explained. Rituals, chanting, herbs, firelight, and the presence of an entire community all signal one powerful message to the brain. You are not facing this alone. That feeling can reduce cortisol, lower the perception of pain, and even influence immune activity. The placebo effect has repeatedly shown that belief alone can trigger measurable biological changes. Maybe the first healer didn't begin by curing disease. Maybe they began by reducing fear. But fairness matters. Ancient medicine had limits, brutal ones. Depending on the place and period, roughly a quarter to half of all children died before the age of 5. Childbirth remained one of the most dangerous events in a woman's life. Appendicitis was usually a death sentence. Sepsis almost always was. There was often nothing left to do except sit beside someone and wait. Average life expectancy looks shockingly low, around 30 to 35 years. But that's mostly because so many children never reached adulthood. Survive childhood, avoid violence, survive childbirth, and reaching your 60s wasn't unusual. Old age existed. It just came with significantly worse customer support. By now, this probably doesn't look like a history of medicine anymore. It looks more like a relay race. A Neanderthal in El Cedrón cave chews a bitter plant because something about it works. 31,000 years ago, a Stone Age surgeon in Borneo removes a shattered leg and somehow keeps the patient alive. 5,000 years later, Ötzi the Iceman carries medicinal fungus across the Alps because experience has already taught him that nature hides useful medicines. The pattern keeps repeating. A Natufian healer spends a lifetime collecting knowledge that can't be written down. Egyptian physicians dress wounds with honey and mold. Greek doctors refine old remedies. Chinese scholars preserve centuries of herbal observations. Modern scientists isolate artemisinin from Artemisia annua. Researchers discover cancer-fighting compounds in the Madagascar periwinkle.
Different continents, different languages, different beliefs, the same experiment. Observe, remember, pass it on. Civilization didn't grow because one generation suddenly became brilliant. It grew because the next generation didn't have to start from zero. Imagine discovering fire every single generation, learning which plants are poisonous every single generation, or volunteering to taste every suspicious mushroom because nobody wrote anything down. Human evolution would have been considerably shorter, mostly because so many volunteers would have been unavailable for future experiments. What carried our species across 50,000 years wasn't one miracle plant. It wasn't one gifted healer. It wasn't even one great discovery. It was the simple decision to refuse to let useful knowledge die. One observation became one lesson. One lesson became one tradition. One tradition became another generation's starting point. And that may be the most powerful survival strategy our species ever evolved. So let's go back to this morning. You wake up with a headache. You open the medicine cabinet. 1 ibuprofen. 45 seconds later, life goes on. Only now, that little pill looks different. Because it isn't just medicine. It's the latest answer to a question humans have been asking for more than 50,000 years. How do we keep one more person alive? Now here's a question for you. If someone living 50,000 years from now looked back at our world, what everyday thing do you think would surprise them the most? I genuinely love to read your answer, so let me know in the comments. Maybe medicine was never humanity's greatest invention. Maybe remembering what worked and making sure someone else remembered too was. So the ibuprofen you swallowed this morning wasn't the beginning of the story. It was simply the newest chapter. And thankfully, it's a lot easier than asking everyone in the cave if they've got anything for a headache.